The airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, rolling suitcases, murmured conversations, and the faint echo of boarding calls bouncing across the terminal walls. But right in the middle of it all stood a woman who was about to shake the entire room without raising her voice. She was small in stature, her back slightly bent with age, her silver-gray braids tied neatly beneath a scarf. She wore a plain cardigan, a pair of simple shoes, and carried an old handbag that had seen better days. To most people passing by, she looked like any other grandmother traveling alone. No one could have guessed that this woman, this quiet, unassuming black grandmother named Evelyn Brown, was not only boarding a plane that day but was the owner of the very airline itself. Yet as she approached the gate where her private jet was waiting, Evelyn was met not with respect, but with laughter. The attendant at the counter raised an eyebrow as Evelyn calmly stated, "That plane is mine." The young woman blinked once, then let out a sharp laugh that turned the heads of everyone nearby. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said mockingly, "but you must be mistaken. That jet isn't for passengers like you." The words carried a sting, dressed up as customer service but dripping with arrogance. A few people in the crowd chuckled. Some pulled out their phones, eager to capture what they thought would be a ridiculous scene. No one in that moment saw Evelyn for who she truly was. They only saw what they assumed she was, an elderly black woman with no power, no influence, and no place near something as glamorous as a private jet. But they were wrong. And they were about to learn just how wrong. Evelyn Brown had lived her entire life pushing through barriers that were never meant to let her pass. To anyone who only saw her as a grandmother with gray hair and wrinkled hands, she might have looked fragile, even ordinary. But behind that gentle smile was a lifetime of struggle, determination, and victories hard won. She had been born in a small southern town during a time when the color of her skin dictated everything, where she could sit, where she could eat, and what kind of life the world expected her to live. For many young black girls in her community, dreams were dangerous things. They were told to be quiet, to accept less, to never aim higher than what had been handed down for generations. But Evelyn had something burning inside her that no one could put out, a vision that her life could be bigger than the limits people tried to cage her in. As a child, she remembered standing barefoot on the dusty front porch of her grandmother's home, staring at airplanes as they roared overhead. They looked like giant silver birds, gliding across the sky with ease. To Evelyn, they represented freedom. They represented a life beyond the dirt roads and factory jobs that trapped so many around her. But when she dared to say, "One day I'll fly in one of those," the adults around her shook their heads, amused by her wild imagination. Some neighbors even laughed openly, saying, "Child, you better learn to dream smaller." Yet, even as a little girl, Evelyn had no interest in small dreams. Her early life was filled with hardship. She worked beside her mother in kitchens, scrubbing pots until her hands ached. She sold bread door to door after school just to bring in extra money. Every penny mattered, every sacrifice counted. But instead of letting those struggles harden her, Evelyn let them shape her. She learned resilience. She learned how to work harder than anyone else in the room. And most importantly, she learned that if doors would not open for her, she would build her own. By her teenage years, she had started a tiny baking business, using her grandmother's recipes. She would wake up before dawn, knead dough until her arms burned, and then carry baskets of bread to neighbors and markets. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She saved every dollar, not for fancy clothes or fleeting luxuries, but for a future she refused to let slip away. Every loaf sold was a brick in the foundation of a dream she hadn't yet fully defined. When Evelyn was old enough to strike out on her own, she expanded from baking into catering. She began serving at community events, weddings, and church gatherings. She built a reputation for excellence, not just in her food, but in her professionalism. People began to see her not only as that girl who bakes, but as a businesswoman. Yet, even with her growing success, the world never stopped reminding her of the barriers she faced. Banks refused her loans, telling her politely but firmly that a venture like this might be too much for you. Investors laughed in her face. Some clients tried to underpay her, assuming she should be grateful just to be hired. But Evelyn was not deterred. Every rejection became fuel. Every insult became proof that she was on the right path. She carried herself with dignity, never begging for respect, but always earning it. Slowly, brick by brick, she built her empire. Her catering business grew into a chain of restaurants. Her restaurants expanded into hospitality contracts. From there, she entered into partnerships that touched the travel industry, and with sharp instincts and relentless grit, she eventually founded her own airline. What started as a little girl watching silver birds fly across the sky turned into ownership of those very wings. A woman in the crowd muttered under her breath, "She's crazy." Another man laughed softly, pulling out his phone to keep recording. "This is gonna go viral," he whispered to a friend. They weren't seeing a powerful businesswoman. They weren't seeing a self-made CEO. They were seeing only what their prejudice let them see, an elderly black grandmother out of place, out of line, and out of her mind. Inside, Evelyn felt the familiar sting of injustice. It wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, and sadly, she knew it wouldn't be the last. But rather than shrink under the weight of their mockery, she drew strength from it. She thought of her grandmother, who had raised her to hold her head high no matter what insults came her way. She thought of her mother, who had told her, "Never let them decide your worth." And she thought of all the battles she had already won, battles tougher than this one, battles where the stakes were far higher than a few cruel laughs. She stood her ground. "Sir," she said evenly, addressing the guard who towered over her. "You're making a mistake." Her words were calm, but her tone carried an authority that seemed to make him hesitate for just a second. That moment of hesitation was quickly drowned out by the impatient scoff of the flight attendant, who rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "She's wasting our time," the attendant muttered. "Go ahead and escort her out before this gets messy." Evelyn could hear the whispers building, the crowd feeding on the tension. Some were entertained, others annoyed, but not a single one saw her for who she truly was. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her, but Evelyn's spirit was unshakable. She knew her truth. She knew her power. And she knew that, in just a matter of moments, everything would change. As the guard finally stepped closer, reaching out to take her by the arm, Evelyn's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She didn't move. She didn't resist. She let the silence stretch, let the crowd lean in closer, let the moment thicken with tension. And then, just as his fingers were about to graze her sleeve, a voice rang out from across the tarmac. "Stop. Stop right now." The crowd turned toward the sound. A man in a crisp pilot's uniform came rushing down the jet stairs, his face pale with panic. His voice trembled with urgency as he shoved past the stunned flight attendant and stepped between Evelyn and the guard. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" he demanded. His hands shook slightly as he pointed to Evelyn. This woman is not some intruder. She is Mrs. Evelyn Brown. She is the founder and CEO of this airline. And that plane," his voice broke with intensity, "that plane belongs to her." By the time Evelyn reached her 60s, she had achieved more than most people could imagine. But she had never lost her humility. She didn't flaunt her wealth. She didn't cover herself in jewels or demand red carpets. She still lived in the same modest neighborhood, still baked pies for her grandchildren, still went to church every Sunday. That was why, on the day she arrived at the airport to board her private jet, she wore a plain cardigan and carried her old handbag. To her, comfort and authenticity mattered more than showing off. She didn't need the world to see her power, it lived within her. And yet, despite all she had built, despite all she had overcome, here she stood again, dismissed, underestimated, disrespected. The staff at the gate didn't see a visionary businesswoman, a self-made CEO, or a trailblazer. They saw only what their prejudices allowed them to see, an old black woman who couldn't possibly belong anywhere near a gleaming private jet. Their laughter, their skepticism, their arrogance, it was the echo of every barrier Evelyn had spent her life breaking down. But if history had taught her anything, it was this: underestimation was her greatest weapon. The more they doubted her, the sweeter it felt when the truth revealed itself. And soon, very soon, everyone in that airport would understand exactly who Evelyn Brown really was. The attendant's laughter rang out, sharp and dismissive, echoing across the boarding area like an insult that couldn't be ignored. "That plane is yours," she said mockingly, her voice loud enough to draw even more curious eyes. "Ma'am, please. You need to stop this nonsense before you embarrass yourself further." The smirk on her face told everyone around her exactly what she thought. This was nothing more than a delusional old black woman making ridiculous claims. A few bystanders chuckled along, their expressions smug, as if they were in on a joke Evelyn didn't understand. But Evelyn understood all too well. She had seen this scene before, many times, played out in different settings with different faces, but always the same attitude: doubt, arrogance, and prejudice wrapped neatly in a smile. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply repeated herself with calm conviction, her voice firm but not angry: "That plane is mine." The crowd gasped quietly, then burst into whispers. The security guard, a tall man with broad shoulders, approached with heavy steps. His posture was aggressive, his jaw clenched as if he had already decided she was trouble. "All right, that's enough," he barked. "You need to step away from this area now. This is your last warning." His hand hovered near Evelyn's arm, a gesture that made it clear he was ready to physically remove her if she resisted. For a heartbeat, the entire terminal went silent. The laughter stopped. The smirks vanished. Every phone lowered slightly as the weight of the pilot's words settled on the crowd like thunder. The same people who had mocked Evelyn just moments before now stared with wide, horrified eyes. The security guard froze mid-motion, his hand dropping to his side. The flight attendant's mouth fell open, her smug confidence evaporating into disbelief. And Evelyn? She simply stood tall, her gaze unwavering, her silence louder than any speech she could have given. She didn't need to say, "I told you so." She didn't need to shout or gloat. The truth had spoken for her, and it had left the room trembling. The silence that followed the pilot's words was thick, almost suffocating. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as though the very air in the terminal had been sucked away, leaving only stunned faces and pounding hearts. The same people who had been laughing just moments earlier now looked as if the ground beneath them had given way. Their smirks had melted into wide-eyed shock. The security guard, who only seconds ago had been so eager to grab Evelyn's arm, now stood frozen in place, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air before he let it fall to his side. The flight attendant was perhaps the most shaken of all. Her face, which had been twisted in arrogance and annoyance, drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She took a stumbling step back, suddenly very aware of the dozens of eyes now staring not at Evelyn, but at her. The confidence she wore like armor had crumbled, leaving only embarrassment and fear in its place. The crowd began to murmur, their whispers carrying waves of guilt, awe, and disbelief. "She owns the airline," one man gasped, lowering his phone as if ashamed of having recorded the scene. "All this time, she was the boss," a woman muttered, covering her mouth. Some people looked down at their shoes, unable to meet Evelyn's gaze. Others stared at her with a kind of reverence, like they were seeing her for the first time. The same old black woman they had dismissed, ridiculed, and underestimated now stood revealed as someone powerful beyond their imagination. Evelyn didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply straightened her cardigan, lifted her chin slightly, and stood in quiet dignity as the truth rippled through the terminal. Her silence was louder than any lecture could have been. It said, "This is who I am. And you were blind to it all along." The pilot turned to Evelyn, his expression full of respect and apology. He bowed his head slightly. "Mrs. Brown, I am so sorry for this disgraceful treatment. Your jet is ready. Please, let me escort you myself." His voice shook, not out of fear for his job, but out of deep shame at seeing the woman who built the very company he worked for treated like she was nothing. Evelyn gave him a small, gracious nod. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice calm but unyielding. Meanwhile, the security guard cleared his throat nervously. He tried to speak, but the words tangled together. I didn't know. I thought," his excuse withered in the air, meaningless. The flight attendant stammered too, her earlier confidence completely erased. "Mrs. Brown, please, I didn't realize who you were," but Evelyn didn't even look their way. Their apologies were not for her, they were for themselves, an attempt to patch up their own shame. She had no interest in them. Instead, Evelyn turned her attention to the crowd. Her eyes swept slowly across the room, meeting the gaze of those who had laughed, those who had whispered, and those who had doubted her. No words passed her lips, but the message was clear: never judge a person by the surface. Never assume you know their worth. Because one day, the person you mock may be the one who owns the very ground you stand on. The murmurs grew louder, but now they carried a different tone. Respect. Awe. Regret. Even fear. Some people hurriedly put their phones away, ashamed of what they had recorded. Others whispered Evelyn's name, as if committing it to memory. And in that tense silence, Evelyn did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a smile of arrogance or revenge, but a small, gentle smile that radiated strength. It was the kind of smile that said, "I've been here before. I'll rise above it again." She began walking toward the jet, the pilot by her side, and the crowd instinctively stepped back to give her space. Each step she took was deliberate, powerful, echoing like a drumbeat in the stunned silence. For many in that terminal, those footsteps would stay etched in their memories forever. They had witnessed not just a revelation, but a lesson, one they would never forget. As Evelyn approached the stairs to her jet, she paused. Without turning back, she said in a calm, steady voice, "Respect is not given to titles. It is given to humanity. Remember that." And with that, she climbed the steps, each movement graceful and unhurried, leaving behind a room full of trembling hearts and guilty faces. As Evelyn reached the top of the jet's staircase, the golden light of the late afternoon sun washed over her, wrapping her in a glow that made her seem almost larger than life. She paused for a moment at the doorway, her hand resting gently on the polished frame, and glanced back at the scene she was leaving behind. Below, the crowd remained frozen, their faces etched with disbelief, shame, and awe. It was as if the entire terminal had turned to stone, each person struggling to process the weight of what they had just seen. Evelyn didn't linger long, she had no need to. With a final calm breath, she disappeared into the jet, the door closing firmly behind her. Inside, the cabin was quiet and serene, a world away from the chaos she had just left behind. Plush leather seats gleamed under soft lights, and the faint hum of the engines promised escape, peace, and control. Evelyn eased into her seat by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. For a moment, she let her eyes close, not out of exhaustion, but out of gratitude. Life had tested her again, in a way she had thought she had outgrown. But even now, at this stage of her journey, she realized the fight for dignity and respect never truly ended. It was a battle she had carried from childhood, through her years of struggle, through her rise as a CEO, and one she would likely continue until her last breath. Yet Evelyn was not bitter. She had learned long ago that bitterness was a poison, and she had chosen instead to carry grace. She reflected on what had just happened, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty. She had once again proven that strength is not always loud, that power does not always shout. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon in the world is dignity, the kind that cannot be shaken, no matter how deeply others try to wound you. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The passengers who had laughed were no longer amused, they were ashamed. A mother clutched her daughter's hand tightly, whispering a lesson she hoped the child would never forget: don't you ever treat someone like that. You never know who they are. The security guard, who had nearly dragged Evelyn out, stood stiff and pale, his chest heavy with regret. The flight attendant wiped at her eyes, her arrogance shattered into humiliation. And the bystanders who had recorded the scene on their phones hesitated. What had started as entertainment now felt like evidence of cruelty, a digital record of their failure to see the humanity in